Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumila Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, email your thoughts to this program to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. 6 months ago, the cognoscenti of Turtle Bay, the UN's location on the east side of Manhattan, were pretty sure that the next head of the nearest thing to a world government would for the first time on 2 counts be an East European and a woman. Quite likely the one who runs UNESCO, the UN's Education and Culture Agency. Instead, it will be a 67-year-old man who was a Social Democrat president of Portugal from 1995 to 2002, and then head of the United Nations refugee body for a decade from 2005. Antonio Guterres, who will succeed Ban Ki-moon at the end of the year, has been welcomed across the global world. Today, on Rights and Recourse, we are looking at the selection of the new Secretary General of the United Nations and taking a look back at Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's legacy and what Antonio Guterres will bring to the world. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Professor Danny Bradlow from the University of Pretoria Faculty of Law, at our Cape Town studio by Ali Kiai, Secretary General of the United Nations Association of South Africa, and lastly from our New York studio, we are joined by our SABC UN correspondent, Sharon Bryce-Pease. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon.
Sharon, let me start with you. Just give us a background to how the Secretary General of the United Nations is selected. Is there a problem there? Probably let's start with you, okay. Professor. Professor, how is the Secretary General selected? We'll go to Sharon once we are sorted out.
Okay, so the UN Security Council makes a recommendation on who they think the Secretary General should be. They make that to the General Assembly of the United Nations, which makes the final selection. This time it was a different process because there was an attempt to be more transparent. So each of the candidates were invited.
No, go ahead. Okay. Go ahead.
We're invited to speak to the generalists, to the UN, and to present their views and to speak to the public as well.
Well, let me go to Sharon, if Sharon is around. Sharon, if you can hear us, how different, or Sharon can't hear us, let's stick with you. How different was the selection this year, and why was it different?
Well, the UN had made a promise to do a more transparent process. Normally in the past, we wouldn't even necessarily have known who the candidates were until the final person was selected. This year, we knew exactly who the candidates were. They campaigned for the position, which is a change from the past. Whether in the end we ended up with a process that produced a more transparent outcome, we don't know yet, in a way, because it looks like there might be some political maneuvering and deals that might have been made in order to get to Mr. Guterres.
Only from your point of view, now that we are told this year the system was different of selecting the Secretary General of the UN, there was a campaign by several people, and many of those were women. Is that the way all selections of office bearers in the United Nations should go?
Actually, the current selection process under Ban Ki-moon's leadership was actually a little more transparent by allowing civil society and the people's voice to be accounted for. They had some campaigns. One of the largest was the one for the 7 billion campaign, which has been mentioned before by many agencies and throughout the press worldwide. But I think during the aftermath of the political situations within the Middle East and other situations around the world, as Professor Bradlow mentions, that there are possibilities of other political entities getting involved and probably politicizing the whole process. But the selection process for the Secretary General comes through by member states actually supporting candidates. So it could actually be per region or per block, and they could appoint in accordance with member states supporting such members. There was a lot of speculation that most probably the Eastern European bloc might get a chance to lead the helm of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, but unfortunately, with the current status quo, with of course the recommendations coming from the Security Council, that's the ante that kind of removes the transparency that we're all aiming to sort for the actual selection process.
What does the UN Secretary do, Secretary General?
So the Secretary General has a number of functions. One is they're the head of the Secretariat, which means they run the organization and the staff of the UN and all its activities. The other one is that they're meant to be the leader of the United Nations, which means, in a sense, they're the leading global governance actor in the world. The truth is that they don't have a lot of power. So a lot of what they have to do is through their persuasive power, their use of their good offices, their ability to convene different groups to talk about issues that are important.
Prof, let's quickly go to Sharon. Sharon is back with us now. Sharon, earlier our question was, what was the selection process? What is the normal selection process for a Secretary General, and how different was it this time?
Dumele, some people would actually call it an abnormal process, as has happened for the past 7 decades, leading up to the selection of Antonio Guterres this year, where essentially the Security Council, the 15-member Security Council, led by those permanent 5 members, would literally pick a candidate behind closed doors and then present this candidate, nominate this candidate to the General Assembly in terms of the UN Charter, and then the GA would essentially rubber stamp or reject the nomination. But over the last 5-6 occasions when that nomination has been put forward, including this year with Guterres, essentially the GA rubber stamps that nomination through a process of consensus. I mean, the other options would have been to have a simple majority vote in the General Assembly, so 50 plus 1, or a 2/3 majority. So that decision is left to member states, and on the last 5 occasions, they've decided to do it through acclamation, through a process of consensus. But what was different about this year was that the process was opened up through an initiative by the President of the General Assembly. Essentially, for the first time in history, you had member states invited to present candidates. Those candidates then will be formally nominated by a government, by various governments around the world, and then they would be put through a process of a 2-hour informal dialogue in an open format, broadcast throughout on UN television and around the world, and where member states were allowed to engage with who the next Secretary General might be. And so you had 13 candidates at the end, spending 2 hours in front of member states, meeting in public forum, whether it was at the Ford Foundation or the Brookings Institution in Washington. And so it was a very public process. And so you had an idea, before the Security Council stepped in, you had an idea of who the good candidates were and who the bad candidates were, who the strong candidate was and who was perhaps weaker. And so that process allowed member states to have input in what the Security Council decided. And in this process, Guterres was a standout candidate from the beginning. I mean, there was broad consensus around that. Yes, there were other strong candidates, but he really was exceptional in that open dialogue, and that bore itself out in the final decision that was made by the Security Council. So a very transparent process this year, as opposed to what we've seen in the past.
Let me go back to something else, Professor. And Ali, if you can hear us, you can come into this too. Yeah. This time there were 6 women candidates, and none of them made it. And one would have wanted an organization like the UN to at least be gender sensitive here.
I think it was gender sensitive in that it's the first time there were so many women candidates. As Sherwin said, Mr. Guterres was by far the standout candidate based on all the reports and the straw polls that were taken. So in that sense, the best person won. On the other hand, it also appears that there were political deals done, which is inevitable, I suppose, in a process like this. For example, there's reports that the Chinese are very interested in a senior position in the new administration. And so that in that sense, the process was traditional.
Let's hear from Ali. Ali, I want to go back to Sharon quickly. Let's hear from you about that. No woman was actually, again, we have in the 70 years of this organization, we have another male Secretary General.
I think your previous comment around being gender sensitive, I don't see the point of actually having a male on as leading, so the actual organization can't be gender sensitive in its working or its top-down approach in how they deal with things. And the currently appointed, to be appointed Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, actually has gender equity and women empowerment as one of his main ideals to continue from Ban Ki-moon's legacy, which Ban Ki-moon started the UN Women entity in 2010. So
Sharon, you attended.
But there was a lot of speculation being built by the media that there should be a woman leading the next next Secretary General, and the speculation from the media was actually that caused a lot of hype around it, and was great. It was creating conversations on the ground that we should actually bring a break onto the male dominancy of the Secretary General, but the working and enabling environment to actually have women leading. It doesn't have to. It could actually be a gradual process that, from the work of Guterres, could actually create a platform that the next candidates could actually be a woman. And again, I should just bring out a point of Professor Bradlow, that the Eastern European bloc, majority being female candidates, and the issues of the Ukraine and the Crimea did negate the fact of the females being selected.
Sharon, you attended a press conference that was addressed by Ban Ki-moon. Before we respond to that, I want to go into the area to talk about Ban Ki-moon's legacy, but before we do that, let's have a look at this interview from that press conference you attended during the week from Ban Ki-moon.
When you leave office, you will very likely be remembered for being a champion on climate change. You will also be remembered for spearheading the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, two historic intergovernmental negotiations that were concluded last year. But observers, though, could reasonably argue that they've not seen the same level of enthusiasm on the question of Security Council reform from this Secretary General. So my question, why is reform a matter best left to member states, and yet other intergovernmental processes have seen you weigh in regularly and with persistence that is largely absent from the reform debate?
Thank you for your kind remarks about my commitment on climate change and other issues. When it comes to reform of the United Nations, particularly Security Council reform, I have been stating many times, I think I don't know how many times repeatedly, that it's a high time that the Security Council must be reformed and changed in a more democratic and representative way. Considering these tremendous circumstances which have been taking place since the founding of the United Nations, there was only one time when the Security Council was changed, but there is a heightened awareness and urging by the member states. But it's, after all, up to the member states who will be responsible for the reform of this Security Council. They have been meeting to negotiate this reform process, I think, longer than 2 decades. Most recently, during the last 6-7 years, they have been meeting in a negotiating forum rather than open-ended. The open-ended session has been over, and General Assembly has taken it in an informal negotiating sessions. And there are many proposals have been proposed, and they have been reviewed and discussed. Unfortunately, not a single issues have been able to see any convergence of opinions among the member states. Each and every country or each and every group of the countries bring their own proposals which have not been able to get the support from others. So it's important that the member state should look at this issue after 2 decades long consultation and negotiation process. There is a high time to discuss this matter. As I'm just about to leave my position, but I'm urging that they should reflect the voices and aspirations of the member state. And the rapidly changing, deteriorating security challenges of the international community really makes it imperative that the Security Council should be changed.
Sharon, I don't know whether you were happy with that response, but it seems to me there's very little the Secretary General can do to effect change.
Not very much, but let me qualify that. I mean, as you discussed with your guests in studio, that he is essentially the chief administrator and doesn't have all the power. So, you know, when things go wrong in Syria, when things go wrong in Burundi or South Sudan, the Secretary General, that's the figurehead and the face of the United Nations, tends to be blamed for this. You know, I'm sure you remember a former AU chairperson, President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, chastising the Secretary General at the AU Heads of State Summit in January. I think it was earlier this year, telling him to sort of take the message back from Africa that it's time for the Security Council to be reformed. But essentially the Secretary General doesn't have that power. It is up to member states. And as he mentioned in that clip, there has been an intergovernmental process ongoing for almost for over 2 decades. The point I was trying to make in that question is that there have been other intergovernmental processes like the Sustainable Development Goals or the achievement of the Paris Climate Change Accord in December last year, where the Secretary General was out front, visible, pushing, coercing, urging. He was extremely visible. This was part of his legacy as Secretary General in his 2 terms. And you don't see that kind of energy, that kind of commitment from him on the issue of Security Council reform. Why that is, I would only be speculating. Maybe it's the P5. Maybe they have private discussions about the fact that they don't want to let go of the veto, but that would be pure speculation. He isn't on the case all the time, and that is what the question was about. So he could certainly be more active, and perhaps we'll see that from his successor in Antonio Guterres.
Professor, one thing I know you are dying to say something. The question is, how then are we going to remember Ban Ki-moon?
Well, I mean, that's what I think Sharon was very diplomatic and accurate in saying that Ban Ki-moon will be remembered for the climate change treaty and for the SDGs. But he didn't mention that he'll also be remembered for the fact that during his term, peacekeeping troops came to Haiti and delivered cholera to Haiti. Haiti had never had cholera, and thanks to the UN coming after the earthquake there, they now have cholera. And the UN has consistently refused to accept any responsibility for that. If Ban Ki-moon was really sincere about reform, he can't do very much about Security Council reform, but he can do something to make the institution more accountable when it's negligent, as it was in the case of Haiti.
Well, if you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011-714-5497 or 5498, alternatively tweet us at Rights Recourse. Please stay with us.
Young girls crossing our borders often find themselves alone in the big city of Johannesburg.
I came here when my pregnancy was 6 months.
Like many other girls from Zimbabwe, Abigail found her way here to the Central Methodist Church.
My friend who was raped, who was forced to have sex at the church.
I insisted that this needed to be handled with the police.
I think we don't have rights. You do what you don't want to do and you'll be forced.
Any refugee in a strange country is vulnerable to forms of abuse and manipulation.
I don't have any option. I can just continue to with the guys so that I can take care of my baby.
I am really deeply moved by the unity and the consensus that both the Security Council and the General Assembly have shown in this process. And I strongly hope that this unity and this consensus are symbolic, that they mean that in unity and consensus, the bodies of the UN and the international community as a whole will be able to face the challenges of today, and will be able to take on time the decisions that are necessary in order to foster peace, in order to end conflicts, and in order to create the conditions for human rights and development to be accessible to all. My feelings could be described by just two words: gratitude and humility. And it is with the same gratitude and humility that I stand before you today, now joined by a profound sense of responsibility. I am fully aware of the challenges the UN faces and the limitations surrounding the Secretary General. The dramatic problems of today's complex world can only inspire a humble approach, one in which the Secretary General alone neither has all the answers nor seeks to impose his views, one in which the Secretary General makes his good offices available, working as a convener, a mediator, a bridge builder, and an honest broker to help find the solutions that benefit everyone involved.
Incoming Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Sherwin, who is Antonio Guterres?
Well, he's a 68-year-old international diplomat. He's a former Portuguese prime minister in the mid to late to early 2000s, and then was subsequently in 2005 appointed High Commissioner for Refugees, a position, Dumile, that he held for 10 years, really putting him at the forefront of the refugee crisis just as it was exploding onto the world psyche in many ways, given developments in Syria. He is a very outspoken critic about the lack of funding for humanitarian initiatives around the world, and has a great deal of experience in understanding a very complex United Nations system. So in many ways, highly qualified to be the next Secretary General.
Only some people believe that the appointment of Antonio Guterres as Secretary General of the United Nations poses a significant danger for the free world, as he has a socialist agenda. Can this socialist agenda be viewed as problematic for the UN?
Well, it's because of the situation right now currently, we realize that the world has
the role of the Secretary General.
Ali, I know we are talking at crossroads, Ali. We have Sherwin in New York. Let's just hear what Sherwin, who's closer to the action, saying about what my question. Sherwin, you remember my question about the socialist agenda. Would that social agenda be viewed as problematic for the UN? Okay, Sherwin, go ahead. I'll come to you, Ali.
Well, there are lots of socialists at the United Nations, very many socialist countries that have big voices at the United Nations. It's very much part of discussions here among member states, but the Secretary General in many ways is the chief accounting officer, is the chief moderator. He is the facilitator and the convener. He does not necessarily always set the agenda. Often the agenda is set by the Security Council, it is set by member states of the General Assembly, and so he becomes the implementer in chief. So I don't think any background, whether you're a communist, whether you're a feisty liberal, whether that is incorporated into the agenda of the Secretary General. The agenda is often set by member states, and he becomes the CEO that essentially implements.
Okay, Ali, you can come in now.
Thank you. Just a couple of points from Shervin's side is that currently Ban Ki-moon's position has been a lot more easier with the West, much more welcoming with the systems of how America likes to lead the Security Council discussions, how the vetoes should be utilized, how in a way handicapped the Secretary General has become not to use his Chapter 99, which is actually the joker card that we call at the UN, that the Secretary General has that power to utilize and make effective change at direction of United Nations policies and implementation strategies. But the incoming Antonio Guterres' background and history could actually be a bit of a game changer from the additional multipolar world that we're seeing that has been happening even at the negotiations of the Security Council. That there's right now Russia's stance on global issues is becoming more stronger. And of course, with the background of Russia coming from the socialist republics, it could actually have an impact on the decision making of Antonio Guterres. And this has been a kind of a policy regarding the Secretary General's appointments between these two great nations on the Security Council.
Prof, coming from a human rights background, if one were to take the fact that Antonio Guterres was the Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN, are we going to see more emphasis on the problem that is facing Europe now regarding immigration, the refugees?
He was the High Commissioner of Refugees.
Thank you, sir.
He did a very credible job as the High Commissioner of Refugees. The one area where he got criticized, ironically, was for being slow to recognize that the Syrian refugee crisis was becoming as serious as it was. One would expect, as a Western European, as someone who's been focused on refugees, he's going to be paying a lot of attention to that issue now. But I think it's also important to remember that of the 65 or so million refugees in the world, about 30% of them are in Africa. And that there's a need to make sure he doesn't forget that there are close to 20 million refugees in Africa that also need UN attention. He's shown that he's a very competent leader, and so that's a good sign. To think that he's going to change anything radically in the UN in the future, I think is optimistic. He doesn't come from that background. His selection process doesn't suggest that. And I don't think there's any reason that he's campaigned to suggest that there'll be serious reforms. That's why I think if you want reform, you have to focus on relatively small, feasible steps that he could take on his own without having to rock the boat for all the UN.
Sharon, do you want to come in there?
I do. Reform at the United Nations will be driven by UN member states. If you look at what is happening in South Sudan today, let's use South Sudan as an example. The UN Secretary General, his peacekeeping chief, Hervé Latsous, has now for months, I think since April this year, been calling for an arms embargo to be instituted. They've also been calling for over a year now. In fact, I think Nabi Pillay was High Commissioner for Human Rights when a senior UN official for the first time called for the situation in Syria to be referred by the Security Council to the International Criminal Court. The Secretary General has now for months been on that bandwagon calling for Bashar al-Assad's government to be referred to the ICC. Has that happened? No, it hasn't. Despite all the urging, despite all the influence that the Secretary General has, it will come down to whether the 5 permanent members of the Security Council agree or don't agree. So as much as he can coalesce, as much as he can urge, the reform agenda is really center to the ability of this United Nations to change. He might urge from the top, he might try and change things within the system, but essentially those big decisions, when it comes down to how are we going to fix this conflict, how are we going to implement climate change, it comes down to the countries themselves. And I think it also goes back to individual countries and national legislatures and elections in national jurisdictions. What would you like to see from the Secretary General? How would you like to see the UN change? And perhaps take it to your ward councillor, take it to the MP that is in charge of your constituency. Maybe that needs to be a bottom-up approach rather than expecting it to come from someone that really doesn't have the power to change it.
Sean, let me stay with you for a while because you're going to have to leave it to us at some stage. The other question I wanted to know is the issue of the fact that there is this commission that is led by Kevin Rudd, the Independent Commission for Multilateralism, which has proposed several new things that the Secretary General we have to be seized with. Some of them are to deepen UN campaign to end violence against women, promote women's political participation worldwide, develop an action agenda for ensuring full participation of women in social and economic recovery. Has the UN succeeded, or is the UN beginning to succeed in those kind of things?
Well, let's look at what happened under Ban Ki-moon's watch. He created UN Women under first Michelle Bachelet, the current president of Chile, and then subsequent to that, South Africa's former deputy president, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. And so this was a completely new entity, basically taking 4 different entities at the United Nations and bringing them under one umbrella. Part of their mandate, Dumile, is to canvass, is to campaign for women's empowerment and gender equality for women. They were the only agency within the UN system that essentially stays neutral in the selection process of the Secretary General. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka was very vocal in the fact that they would like to see a female Secretary General. And just to correct you from earlier, you said there were 6 female candidates. There were actually 7 with the inclusion of Georgieva, Kristalina Georgieva from Bulgaria. So yes, these things take time. But they certainly have been moves in that regard.
The UN's first Secretary General, Trygve Lie, said this is the most difficult job in the world, and observation reiterated by most of his other 7 successors.
Yes, because as we've been saying, the Secretary General has very little power other than the persuasive moral power that they can bring to bear, and that means change is always very slow. I think it's also important to remember the example of Boutros Ghali, who was from Egypt and only served 1 term as Secretary General because he was seen by some of the Permanent 5 as being too aggressive in pushing for change, and so they removed him. And that, I think, sent a lesson to future Secretary Generals on how far they can go in pushing change. So I think it is a difficult position. And I think one of the optimistic things about Mr. Guterres is he seems to understand well how to maneuver in this environment.
The stakes are quite high for Mr. Guterres, Ali, that there are 244 million migrants in the world. More than 65 million people are now forcibly displaced. Half of them are children, women, and refugees running for their lives too often face grave dangers on their safety their journey to safety. How is Mr. Guterres going to deal with those things?
Well, hopefully with his previous experiences by heading the UN Human Rights
Refugee Commission.
UN Refugee Commission. Actually, the issue with the refugee crisis has been a long, tedious issue within the organs of the United Nations. Even the Human Commission for Refugees actually doesn't have the mandate for the IDPs either. So that's another additional. I think about 60% of the refugees are actually internally displaced people within their own countries. So another issue that also systematically makes this a more difficult systematic process is actually the problem of funding the organ, and how Mr. Antonio Guterres has been actually lobbying European countries and Western nations to actually increase their funding towards this important organ of the United Nations. And he's actually trying to systemize and streamline the processes and increase their staff in the field offices to push the application process quicker to alleviate the problems that the refugees face on the ground. But of course, most of the refugees are coming out of areas of conflict and systems where the governments have been either dysfunctional and foreign nationals or foreign states have been intervening in a process for a mutual dialogue in the communities.
Shown earlier, talking about...
For that to be resolved, he needs to have the backing of the P5 and Security Council to resolve these peace and security and enabling environment issues that will actually alleviate the problem and resolve in the communities.
Can I come in?
So when you come in, you can come in.
The point I just wanted to make was, you mentioned Boutros Ghali and how he was kicked out because he fell out of favor with the United States government, who vetoed his a possible second term. And when he passed away earlier this year, I had a chat with former President Thabo Mbeki, who happened to be in New York at the time. And I said to him, what sort of leader do you think the United Nations requires in a Secretary General? And he said, you need a statesman. You need someone that is a statesman that can stand toe-to-toe with world leaders on the world stage, that isn't growing in the position. And if you remember, with Ban Ki-moon's appointment in 2007, he was a fairly unknown foreign minister from South Korea that was selected behind closed doors and then presented to the Secretary General, didn't really speak English very well, was unable, because Korean is not one of the official languages of the United Nations, was really unable to make his point. If you read some of his speeches, and he's got some really good speech writers, and they'll have a real zinger of a line, and somehow he wouldn't deliver it just the way it should have been delivered, and then it all falls flat. So I think what you then have in Antonio Guterres, he's a former statesman, he's served at the highest levels of government in Portugal, he knows everybody, he is very outspoken. I think he might challenge some of the P5 members into what he'd like to see, as we saw with Kofi Annan before that. And you know what, he got into trouble with the oil for food scandal with the United States. So I think you're going to see a different posture from the Secretary General. He is fluent in English, in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese. He speaks 4 of the official languages here, and I think he will stand toe-to-toe with world leaders on the global stage.
Difficulty, though, is the fact that there's as we have already said in the show, there's very little a Secretary General can do. But let's go to a break. When we come back, I'll pose that question to you, Prof, here in the studio. If you'd like to join us, you can always tweet us at Recourse, and also you can send us your emails at recourse@sabc.co.za. Stay with us.
Information-hungry viewers stay with SABC News, as issues on the West are different from issues on the East or here in Johannesburg. So it is not surprising that people who follow the news know that there are 2 things for sure: that anything can happen, and SABC News will tell you when it does. Because we keep the nation fully informed. We are SABC News.
A conscious move from being a street kid to being a barrister of note.
Keep on praying for me to make a better life.
A creative application of the mind on an essential need: water in wheelbarrow containers.
How about if we were to come up with an idea of an enclosed container that sits on top of the frame of a wheelbarrow?
With the sharing of resources, a boy with Russell Silver syndrome receives medication.
The fact that you just said to me, well, you're covered for next month, that's amazing.
So that's the medication.
For more inspiring stories, stay tuned to Bupilong every Friday.
I have long been aware of the hurdles women face in society, in the family, and in the workplace just because of their gender. I have witnessed the violence they are subject to during conflict or while fleeing it just because they are women. And I have tried to address these through every public office I have ever held. And the protection and the empowerment of women and gender parity in the organization are and will continue to be a priority commitment to me. I believe that diversity in all its forms is a tremendous asset, not a threat. And that in societies that are more and more multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious, diversity can bring us together, not drive us apart. We must make sure that we are able to break this alliance between all those terrorist groups or violent extremists on one side and the expressions of populism and xenophobia on the other side. These two reinforce each other, and we must be able to fight both of them with determination.
Antonio Guterres there shown, yes, so you can see the delivery, also the emphasis on certain places that is a completely different man from Ban Ki-moon. But surely there's something he mentions there that we must not allow the international terrorism to spur on. He might be saying that, but surely on the ground we see something different between the fight between the United States and Russia.
Well, I think it's more a broader point about some of the rhetoric you're seeing in different parts of the world, whether you're talking about Brexit in the United Kingdom or the rise of a Republican presidential candidate in Donald Trump, making disparaging comments about people that are coming into the United States, whether it's Syrian refugees, whether it's Mexicans, whether it's Muslims more broadly. And I think the point there that Guterres is making is that we have these two opposing elements that need to be addressed. We have the rise of non-state actors, the rules of war have completely changed with the likes of Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab and ISIS, and that is terrifying people. That is terrifying people that associate an entire religion with groups like this, violent jihadist extremists. So it is he wants to be a counterbalance. So already he's trying to find sort of the consensus path between these very, very opposing rules. Worldviews, and I think the point there is that he talks about the need for human dignity, that's going to be his cause, and I think really trying to bridge the divide we see growing in different parts and different regions of the world.
Professor, he made mentions there of diversity. Will that diversity be reflected in his staff, in the way in his office, or is that diversity we see we should look to the east, to the west, to Africa for leadership?
I think a couple of things. One is, as we've been saying, his power comes from his moral stature. And many of the issues he's going to work on are going to be driven by world events and the great powers. But he can pick a couple of issues where he can take a particular leadership role, and at least in terms of trying to raise awareness and to try to take some initiatives on the ground. And one of them, it seems from his speech, is going to be around gender and around tolerance and respect for diversity, and that has to begin with being respected in his own staff and in the things that he says and does around the world. And I think he'd reflect that in the way he shows respect for regional organizations and regional diversity in approaches to solving problems. I think the other issue where he really should be taking a lead, to go back to my point about Haiti, is that the UN has become over time not just an organization that's a political organization, but an organization that is doing a lot of things in a lot of different countries where it directly affects the lives of human beings. And it has to be made accountable to those human beings when it doesn't exercise those responsibilities appropriately. And no UN leader so far has been willing to show that kind of respect for accountability. And I think if you're talking about diversity and tolerance, that part of that is showing that you want people who are harmed by the misdeeds of your organization to have a way to seek redress when that happens to them. And so I'd hope he would work on that as well.
Only quickly, I would also want Sharon to come in here. Despite peacekeeping being the biggest task of the United Nations, it has faced some very real challenges, especially in Africa, where some of its soldiers were actually charged for having committed rape.
Yes, the United Nations peacekeeping operations in Africa have been quite unfortunate in that regard. That's some of the countries actually bringing troops to feed into the mission have been exposed for or accused of sexual crimes. Actually, some have been also accused of killing civilians, especially in CAR and Darfur. So the issue to actually also to follow from Professor Bradley's account is that to keep these things accountable, we have to always go back to the countries actually supplying those peacekeeping troops to the operations and the mandates of peacekeeping missions. If I just could pose a question to Professor Azzo, could actually those countries who have the troops that are perpetrating such crimes, create such remove their functional impunity on those peacekeeping operatives and actually charge them back in their home country? Of course, this would have implications on the state's vision and mission in supplying troops to the peacekeeping operations. But they account for governments to actually realize that they could actually remove the impunity on their own soldiers and take them into national domestic courts to try them. This could be one means of actually bringing more accountability, as the professor mentioned, into the system.
Sharon, there was an investigation into these kind of things, especially what happened in the Congo and probably in the in one or other African country, the Central African Republic. What happened to those investigations?
There are so many cases, Dumile, that the investigations are continuing. And just to speak to the point about jurisdiction, the UN doesn't have prosecutorial jurisdiction over military troops that are sent to the different peacekeeping missions by what we call TCCs, troop contributing countries. They are, the member states are responsible for the investigations and the prosecutions with assistance from the United Nations, but essentially if someone will be tried in a military court, that is the purview of the troop contributing country. So those investigations are continuing. There have been some prosecutions, including troops from the South African National Defence Force in the Eastern DRC, stationed near Goma. So those processes are continuing. And then to the previous point about Haiti, the language, and I'm just going to bring up a note here, the language from the United Nations, and I think the point you were referring to earlier was the immunity that the United Nations has because it sends people all over the world. So there's a clause that gives it immunity. There was actually a court case in federal court here in New York that was dismissed, a class action claim against the United Nations for bringing cholera into Haiti that was dismissed by federal court because of the immunity that the United Nations enjoys. But the language has since changed from the Secretary General. Let me just read you something. The UN has become convinced that it needs to do much more regarding its own involvement in the initial outbreak. There are now 2 tracks just announced by the Deputy Secretary General this past week. The first track involves intensing efforts in Haiti, especially post the Hurricane Matthew that has devastated large parts of the island, to rebuild sanitation infrastructure, water infrastructure. But in addition to that, the Secretary General, before he leaves his term of office, will present a note to member states of the United Nations on funding initiatives to help the people that have been affected there, whether it's people that are currently suffering from cholera or people who have since died. Some 10,000 people have succumbed to the outbreak that was brought there, we suspect, by Nepalese peacekeepers sent there post the earthquake there a few years ago.
Can I just
come in, Professor?
A couple of things in response to that. It's true that with the peacekeeping troops, who has jurisdiction is a complicated issue. And many times it's the countries that should take some of the responsibility, but it's not that the UN has no responsibility. The question with these things is there some mechanism that can be put in place that would allow for an independent investigation of these incidents to see what happened, who was responsible, what lessons can be learned from that, And this is not unprecedented. The UN Development Programme has a mechanism like that now. The World Bank and all the development banks have them now. There is no reason that the UN couldn't create a similar mechanism. There will be complications because peacekeeping operations are different from building a project like a World Bank funded project, but it is doable. It makes no sense in today's world that when something like the tragedy in Haiti happens, the UN doesn't even feel it has to appear in the courts in New York because it's got immunity. It can basically say to the US courts, we've got immunity, you get rid of this case, we're not even bothering to come there. That does not make sense in today's world, given the role the UN plays.
I am reminded, I'm coming to you, Ali, but let me speak to Sharon first. I'm reminded here by the fact that the Americans do not want to avail troops to the United Nations peacekeeping missions because they do not want their troops to be charged under the United Nations. Will that ever be solved?
I mean, I don't think troops can be charged. I mean, they all enjoy, in terms of the status of forces agreement that are signed with countries where troops are deployed to, there is a level of immunity, especially when you're dealing with the military. So the United States has been very reticent to contribute troops on the grounds, given the fact that they have troops in other war scenarios around the world, bilateral in that sense. But they are also one of the biggest contributors financially to peacekeeping. So that's how they make the argument. We give you a lot of money so that you can run these operations, but we're not going to put boots on the ground.
Let me come back to something else, Ali. Ali, one of the problems the world is facing a great deal, the difficulties facing the world today are issues like human trafficking, slavery in some parts of the world, and many people are saying the UN has not been able to deal with these things.
On the issue of human trafficking and modern day slavery, unfortunately, again, the one pertinent problem with the United Nations and its means to effectively create change has to go through the member states. And the right of sovereignty of member states, again, kind of limits or hinders the process of operations to actually resolve these kind of issues. The one mandate that could actually be a means to solve such problems is that if another member state, through sponsors from their other governments, could actually push through a resolution within the General Assembly to actually voluntarily, like what happened with South Africa during apartheid, voluntarily actually stop these crimes, because the perpetrators are occurring because of financial gain mostly, and the human traffickers mostly from Southeast Asia and Middle East currently, with the issue of the migrants and the
gentlemen, apparently we have run out of time. Sorry, Ali, we have run out of time, and thank you very much for your time. Sharon, thank you very much to you. I appreciate the fact that you're able to get up so early to be with us. Ali, thank you very much. And in his last speech to his staff, Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld said the following: "But although the dangers may be great and although our role may be modest, we can feel that the work of the organization is the means through which we all jointly can work so as to reduce the dangers. It would be too dramatic to talk about our task as one of waging war for peace, but it is quite realistic to look at it as an essential and within its limits effective work for building dams against the floods of disintegration and violence." The views expressed in this show are not necessarily those of the SABC. This show is repeated at 5 on Wednesday morning. From all of us here in the studio, good afternoon, and we'll see you again.